Marcus Thompson stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his casual weekend attire. A neat polo shirt and pressed khaki pants. Even on his day off, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 8 years of experience as a federal prosecutor. Today was supposed to be simple, just a quick trip to the courthouse to file some personal property documents. The autumn morning greeted him with gentle sunlight as he pulled his modest Honda Civic into the courthouse parking lot. Marcus had purposely chosen to handle his personal business on a Saturday, hoping to avoid the usual weekday rush. As he walked toward the entrance, he felt a difference in the atmosphere then again. He was clad in his regular formal suit and carrying his Justice Department badge at the security checkpoint. Maris observed the subtle shift in the guard's expressions. Officer Pete, normally greeting him with a cheery "Good morning, mister." Thompson on weekdays eyed him now with suspicious scrutiny. Guard's hand rested a little too eagerly on his belt as Marcus passed through the metal detector. "Arms out, sir," the second guard commanded. Despite the detector remaining silent, Marcus complied without complaint, having experienced such random checks before. He maintained his composure as they waved the handheld detector across his body. "For the second time, purpose of your visit?" the guard questioned, holding Marcus' driver's license longer. "The necessary filing property documents at the clerk's office," Marcus replied, calmly, knowing how the guard's eyes darted between his face and the ID photo. As if inconsistencies finally cleared to enter, Marcus walked through the quiet hallways, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The courthouse felt different on weekends. Emptier, more imposing. A skeleton crew of staff moved about, the curious glances following him as he passed. Reaching the information desk, Marcus found an elderly clerk he didn't recognize. "Excuse me, I need to tie into the property records division," he said politely. The clerk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle. "Third-floor courtroom 3, they're handling all administrative matters today, owing to renovations in the clerk's office." She waved him off with a dismissive hand. Marcus checked his watch. 10:15 a.m. He shouldn't be there longer than 30 minutes, which should give him plenty of time to get to his nephew's noon basketball game. Instead of taking the elevator, he chose the stairs. His mind was forward to the basketball game. The third floor felt too quiet. He followed the posted signs to courtroom 3. The heavy wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, the sound echoing through the nearly empty chamber. To his surprise, a small court session appeared to be in progress. Judge William Barrett, a man Marcus had heard about but never appeared before, sat on the bench. The judge's steel gray hair and stern expression matched the rumors of his rigid demeanor. Several court staff members were scattered around, along with a few people who appeared to be waiting their turn for various administrative matters. Before Marcus could step back and check if he had the right room, Judge Barrett's sharp voice cut through the air. Well, look who finally decided to grace us with their presence." Marcus opened his mouth to explain his presence, but the judge continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you think court schedules are merely suggestions that we all wait here at your convenience?" Confusion swept over Marcus as he realized the judge was addressing him as if he were an expected participant in the proceedings. He tried to speak again. "Your Honor, I apologize, but I'm here for silence." Judge Barrett's gavel cracked against the sound block. "That's enough of your disrespect. We have been waiting since 9 a.m. for case number 2347, and you come in here like you're just out taking an afternoon stroll around the park." The few people in the courtroom turned to stare at Marcus, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. A young court clerk whispered something to her colleague. Both of them watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his face a mask of professional calm. In his mind, he counted slowly to 10, a technique he had learned long ago for dealing with such situations. He knew what was happening, had seen it before, but this time something felt different. This time, he wasn't just going to let it light. The morning sun streamed through the high courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor as Judge Barrett prepared to deliver what he thought would be a routine scolding to just another tardy defendant. He had no idea he was about to make one of the biggest mistakes of his judicial career. Judge Barrett leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, his face with each passing second. Morning light refined and caught the silver streaks in his hair as he continued to glare down at Marcus, still perfectly still in the middle of the courtroom. "Case number 2347, public disturbance," the judge said much too loudly, shuffling through papers he hoped were relevant. "Not only are you over an hour late, but you have the audacity to appear in such casual attire. This is a court of law, not a shopping mall. Marcus took a careful breath, making sure his voice would remain level. Your Honor, if I could just explain. Speak when I tell you to speak. Judge Barrett's voice echoed off the courtroom walls. The few individuals in the courtroom wiggled uncomfortably in their seats. A young court reporter's fingers rested on her keyboard. Her eyes moved from the judge to Marcus and back again. The judge continued his ranchiate. I see this type of disrespect altogether too much nowadays. People who think they can just waltz in here on their own schedule, dress like they're going to a backyard barbecue. He picked up a document from his desk, clearly not even related to Marcus, and waved it in the air. Sarah Chun, a veteran court clerk of 20 years, noticed something off. She remembered Marcus from his repeated appearances as a prosecutor, but by the time she was able to say anything, Judge Barrett was already rendering his sentence. $500, he said, his gavel hovering threateningly. $500 for contempt of court, to be paid immediately. Perhaps that will teach you the importance of punctuality and proper court etiquette. Marcus' shoulders squared, almost imperceptibly. His jaw clenched, but his voice remained remarkably calm. Your Honor, there seems to be a misunderstanding. And not a misunderstanding. Judge Barrett's laugh was sharp and dismissive. The only misunderstanding here is your belief that this court will tolerate such blatant disregard for its procedures. Do you need me to explain what contempt of court means? The condescension in the judge's voice made even the BFF when Sarah Chun had finally found the courage to stand up. A folder clutched to her chest, but the judge waved her away without even looking at her. Your Honor, Marcus started over, his voice taking on a different cadence, one that made several of the court veterans present sit up straighter. I am Federal Prosecutor Marcus Thompson from the United States Attorney's Office. I'm here to file property documents as the clerk's office is under renovation and not your 9 o'clock a.m. case. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Barrett's face, which had been red with anger, suddenly drained of all color. His gavel, which he had been about to bring down again, froze. Me there. Sarah Chin quietly sank back into her chair, her hand covering her mouth. You're... For the first time that morning, the judge seemed at a loss for words. He frantically shuffled through his papers, as if hoping to find something to justify his actions. If you check your records, Marcus continued, his voice remaining professional, but now carrying an unmistakable weight, you'll find that your 9 a.m. case, 234-7, already called to reschedule. That message should be on your desk somewhere. Sure enough, buried under the scattered papers on Judge Barrett's desk was a bright pink message slip noting the request to reschedule. The judge stared at it, then back at Marcus, then at the message again. The other people in the courtroom had become absolutely still, watching the scene unfold like the witnesses to a slow-motion car crash. The young court reporter had stopped typing entirely, her hands frozen over her keyboard. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. Judge Barrett finally managed to say, his voice having lost all its previous authority. There's indeed been a grave error. Yes, Your Honor, there has. Marcus said the words quietly, but they held so much weight. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his Justice Department ID, hoping it up not just for the judge to see but for everyone present to witness. The gold badge caught the morning light, sending a sharp reflection across the courtroom. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, clearly fumbling to compose himself. The contempt charge is of course dismissed, and I would like to extend my most sincere thank you, Your Honor. Marcus cut in evenly, but I think we should talk about this in your chambers unless you would prefer to continue this discussion here in open court with the recording running. The judge's face had turned even whiter when he fully realized what had just transpired. He nodded hastily and stood from the bench, motioning toward his chamber doors as Marcus followed the judge toward his chamber's courtroom, silent. Tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. The heavy oak door of Judge Barrett's chambers closed behind them with a soft click. The judge's private office was impressive. The walls were lined with leather-bound low books, framed certificates, and a large window overlooking the COR house garden where fallen autumn leaves danced in the morning breeze. Judge Barrett hurried behind his desk, pulling out his chair like a shield between himself and Marcus. Mr. Thompson, I cannot begin to express my doubt. Please sit down. Your Honor, Marcus interrupted quietly, taking one of the leather chairs facing the desk. His tranquil manner drove the intensity up. We have several things to discuss. The judge sank into his chair, his usual confidence totally gone. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, he felt like he was the one on trial. A thin layer of sweat appeared on his forehead as Marcus placed his Justice Department credentials on the desk between them. Let's review what just happened out there. Marcus began, his voice modulated and lucid. You saw a black man enter your courtroom in casual clothes without asking for his name or checking any documentation. You immediately assumed he was a defendant. Is that a fair assessment? Judge Barrett shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Thompson, I assure you race had nothing to do with really. Marcus leaned forward slightly. So you regularly find white attorneys who enter your courtroom $500 without checking their identity first. The silence that followed was heavy outside. They could hear the faint sounds of people walking in the hallway, none of whom had a single inkling of the dramatic scene playing out in the judge's chambers. I have a case file in front of me. Judge Bark tried to explain, his voice weak. I was expecting a defendant for case number 2347, a case that was rescheduled. Marcus pointed out something you would have known if you had taken even a moment to check your messages or ask for my name. Instead, you made assumptions, dangerous assumptions. Your Honor. Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. What's interesting is that this isn't the first time something like this has happened in your courtroom. Over the past month, I've received several complaints about similar incidents. The judge's face, which had started to regain some color, went pale again. Complaints, yes, Marcus continued, opening the folder. 3 African-American attorneys reported being mistaken for defendants in your court. 2 others were asked to show their bar credentials when their white colleagues weren't. All of these incidents are now part of an ongoing investigation by the Judicial Conduct Committee. Judge Barrett's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. An investigation? I wasn't aware you weren't supposed to be. Marcus replied, but after today's incident, I think we need to address this directly. Your actions in the courtroom weren't just embarrassing, Your Honor. They were a demonstration of the exact kind of systemic bias we're working to eliminate from our justice system. A robin landed on the windowsill outside, its red breast bright against the gray autumn sky. Judge Barrett stared at it, seemingly lost in thought before speaking again. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus straightened in his chair. That depends partly on you, Your Honor. The incident in the courtroom today was recorded. The contempt charge you tried to impose on me is documented. I could file a formal complaint which, combined with the other incidents we're investigating, would likely lead to a full review of your judicial conduct. The judge's shoulders slumped. 20 years of career achievements suddenly felt very fragile. However, Marcus continued, I'm more interested in creating meaningful change than pursuing punishment. I want to know what you're going to do to counter these biases in your courtroom. Judge Barrett looked up, surprise etched upon his face. You're giving me a chance to fix this. I'm giving you a chance to be part of the solution. Marcus corrected him, but that starts with acknowledging the problem. Those people out there in your courtroom, they deserve better. Each and every person that walks through those doors deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter what they're wearing or what they had on. The judge nodded, slow realization dawning on his face. This wasn't about one mistake on a Saturday morning. This was about a pattern of behavior that needed to change. What do you suggest? Judge Barrett finally asked, ready to listen. Marcus reached into his briefcase once more, pulling out another document. I have some ideas, but first I want to hear your thoughts on what happened today. Real change starts with honest self-reflection, Your Honor. Outside the chamber doors, the courthouse continued its quiet Saturday routine, unaware that inside this room, a small but not insignificant step toward justice was taking place. By Monday morning, news of the Saturday incident had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. The story grew with each retelling. How federal prosecutor Marcus Thompson had been mistaken for a defendant, how Judge Barrett had tried to find him, and how the whole scene had unfolded in front of witnesses. Linda Martinez, a veteran court reporter with 25 years of experience, sat in the courthouse cafeteria, surrounded by a group of eager listeners. I heard it from Sarah Chin herself, she said, stirring her coffee. The judge didn't even let Mr. Thompson speak before trying to slack him with that fine. Can you imagine one of our most respected federal prosecutors at a corner table, 3 young law clerks huddled over their phones, reading news articles that had already begun appearing on local legal blogs? The headline, Federal Prosecutor Faces Discrimination in Local Court, glowed on their screens. Meanwhile, in the U.S. Attorney's office on the 5th floor, Marcus sat in his office, his phone ringing off the hook. Janet Wong, his colleague of 5 years, knocked on his open door. "Marcus, you gotta see this," she said, walking in with her tablet. "It's everywhere. The Black Lawyers Association just released a statement in support of you, and they're calling for a full investigation into judicial bias in the county courts." Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking at the family photo on his desk, him and his wife at their daughter's college graduation. "This was never just about me, Janet. This was about every person coming in that courthouse being judged based on their appearance and not their character." His office phone rang again. This time, it was the chief judge from the district court requesting a meeting ASAP. A simple incident at the weekend had spiraled way out of control. Elsewhere in the building, Judge Barrett sat in his chambers in solitude, looking down at the messages on his desk, which just seemed to mount. His morning docket had already been reassigned to another judge pending review. Thus far, his secretary, Mrs. Anderson, had fielded calls from 3 different news organizations. The judge picked up one of the messages. This one was from his daughter, a civil rights attorney in Chicago. "Dad, we need to talk." It read simply. He could imagine her disappointment, and it hurt more than any official reprimand could. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Robert Chun, the court administrator, looking uncomfortable. "Judge Barrett, the Judicial Conduct Committee has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're requesting your presence and all your case records from the past year." In the courthouse lobby, security guard Pete Watson was giving Marcus extra scrutiny just 2 days ago. He watched as a group of protesters began gathering outside. Their signs read, "Raid Justice, Justice should be colorblind and end judicial bias now." Local news vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky. Back in Marcus' office, his phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "You're trending on Twitter, honey. Your daughter says you're her hero again." He smiled, remembering the conversation at breakfast yesterday. How his teenage daughter had once asked him why he wasn't angrier about what happened. Sometimes he had told her the best way to fight injustice is to expose it cool and make people face their own biases. This time, Janet returned to his office with more news. "Marcus, you won't believe this," she said. 5 more attorneys have come forward with similar stories about Judge Barrett, and not just Black attorneys, Hispanic Canadian lawyers too. "This is bigger than we thought," Marcus nodded, standing up to look out of his window at the growing crowd below. "Change never comes easily, Janet, but sometimes it takes one incident to open everyone's eyes." His office phone rang again. This time it was the State Bar Association, inviting him to be a keynote speaker at their forthcoming conference on judicial reform. As he listened to their invitation, Marcus watched more protesters joining the group outside. Among them, he saw several familiar faces: attorneys, court staff, and even some judges. "The aftermath is always the hardest part," he said to Janet after hanging up. "Now comes the real work, making sure this leads to not headlines, real change." Next to the photo of his family on his desk lay the property documents he had initially come to file that Saturday morning. They now almost seemed trivial in comparison to what that simple errand had set in motion. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the biggest changes come out of the smallest moments. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. Their voices rose, calling for justice, calling for change. Inside the courthouse, people went about their business, but nothing truly felt as it once did. Something had shifted, like a first crack in a dam, small but significant, promising the possibility of greater change to come. The conference room of the Judicial Review Board was alive with tension Thursday morning as 7 senior judges and legal experts sat around a huge oak table, their faces stern as they perused the ever-increasing pile of evidence before them. At the head of the table, Chief Judge Patricia Rodriguez pushed a pair of reading glasses further up the bridge of her nose as she read from the detailed report in front of her. Over the past 3 days, she informed the room, "We've received 23 formal complaints about Judge Barrett's conduct. Each case has been carefully documented." She held up a thick folder. "What we're seeing here is not just about last Saturday's incident." Mark Chun, the court's data analyst, stepped forward with his laptop. His presentation appeared on the large screen behind him, showing colorful graphs and charts. "Our initial analysis of Judge Barrett's last 3 years of cases shows some disturbing patterns," he explained, pointing to a bar. Minority defendants received on average 40% higher fines and 35% longer sentences for similar offenses. The room erupted with whispers as the board members leafed through the statistics. Judge Rodriguez called the room to order before resuming. "We also have a complaint from a group of minority attorneys who have expressed grievances against him." Sarah Chin sat nervously on a chair against the wall, awaiting her turn to testify. She was the court clerk and had worked in Judge Barrett's courtroom for 5 years. Today, it seemed, were many things she could no longer hold her tongue about. "Miss Chun," Judge Rodriguez called, "please relate the board what you've observed." Sarah's hands shook slightly as she stood. "Over the past 5 years, I have viewed Judge Barrett to continue to ask minority attorneys to prove their credentials and seldom challenge white attorneys. Last month, he did this a total of 6 different times, where he called the minority attorney and confused them with the defendant in another part of the courthouse." Marcus Thompson sat with the investigation team, reviewing security footage from Judge Barrett's courtroom. The team had collected videos from dozens of cases, showing a clear pattern of disparate treatment based on race. "Check this one out," said investigator James Martinez, pointing to a screen. "Last March, an Asian American attorney was held in contempt for being 5 minutes late, while the previous week a white attorney was 15 minutes late and received only a verbal warning." Marcus made careful notes, his expression professional. "We have to make sure we cover all of our bases," he reminded the team. "This isn't about one judge anymore. This is about identifying and correcting systemic bias in our entire judicial system." Down the hall, Judge Barrett sat alone in a small conference room, reviewing his own case history. With growing horror, each file told the same story: unconscious bias affecting his decisions, prejudices he hadn't even realized he held showing up in case after case. His hands shook as he picked up another file. This one showed how he had denied bail to a black defendant for a minor offense while granting it to a white defendant in an almost identical case the very next day. "How did I not see this?" he whispered to himself, running his hands through his gray hair. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Dr. Angela Williams, a racial bias expert brought in by the review board. "Judge Barrett," she said gently, "are you ready to begin our session?" Meanwhile, in the courthouse lobby, reporters gathered as more people came forward with their stories. Amanda Torres, a public defender, spoke to a local news crew about her experiences in Judge Barrett's courtroom. "It wasn't just the big things," she explained, "it was the small things too, the tone of voice, the assumptions where people used to be treated in various ways based on their appearance." Within the conference room back from review boardroom, Judge Rodriguez closed another folder, addressed her co-meeting members. "This investigation has shown us more than the bias of one judge. It has shown us gaps in our whole system of oversight." She rose, looking around at each board member. "We need new protocols for monitoring judicial conduct, regular bias training for all court personnel, and a clear system for reporting and addressing discrimination." The investigating team should, having worked late into the evening. Their office lights glowed in the darkened courthouse. They knew that their findings would affect not only Judge Barrett's future, but the future of the entire judicial system in their district. Marcus left the courthouse that evening, carrying a thick folder of evidence with him as he walked towards his car. He passed the wall where the motto of the courthouse hung: "Equal justice under law." For the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. Maybe now those words would start to mean something more. The investigation wasn't just punishment for one judge anymore. It had morphed into a catalyst to take a closer look at the entire system, forcing everyone to meet head-on the uncomfortable truths about justice in America. Friday evening, 1 week from it all, Judge William Barrett sat alone on the wooden bench in the garden of the courthouse, watching the sun set into the evening sky, painting its shades of orange and purple. His hands held the manila envelope bearing the preliminary findings of the investigation, and what that had revealed shook him to his core. His mind wandered back to a conversation he had with his daughter Rachel earlier that day. As a civil rights attorney in Chicago, she hadn't held back her thoughts. "Dad," she had said over the phone, her voice firm but caring, "do you remember when I was 12 and you taught me about justice? You said a judge must see with clear eyes and an open heart. What happened to that, Dad?" Now, sitting in the quiet garden, those words echoed in his mind. He opened the envelope again, though he had already memorized its contents. The statistics were undeniable in that he had given minorities an average of 40% higher fines, questioned the credentials of minority attorneys 27 times more often than their white colleagues, shown consistent patterns of bias and bail decisions in the past 3 years. There was a soft breeze that rustled the leaves of the trees in autumn around him. As he remembered concrete cases, there was this young black attorney whom he had mistaken for a defendant last spring. The Hispanic law clerk whom he had questioned if she had any business being in the judge's chambers, and count the small moments of prejudice. He never even noticed at the time the garden door opened and Dr. Angela Williams, the racial bias expert, walked out. She had been working with him all week, helping him understand his unconscious biases. Seeing him alone on the bench, she decided to join him. Heavy reading, she asked, gesturing to the envelope. Judge Barrett nodded slowly. "I've been on the bench for 15 years. He said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I always prided myself on being fair, on following the law. But these numbers, the stories, they tell a different story." Dr. Williams sat quietly, letting him continue. "You know what really gets me?" he said, picking up a fallen leaf. "I never saw it all these years. I was so convinced I was being impartial that I couldn't see my own prejudices staring me right in the face." He remembered Monday morning when he finally gathered the courage to watch the security footage of his courtroom. He had seen himself through new eyes, way his tone changed with different people, have his body language shifted, the assumptions he made based on appearance alone. "Recognition is the first step," Dr. Williams replied in a quiet tone. "Many never even make it this far inside the courthouse." The lights were still on in Marcus Thompson's office. The federal prosecutor had just finished reading Judge Barrett's written statement to the review board. In his words, there was something surprising, authentic introspection and contrition. Meanwhile, in the garden below, Judge Barrett stood up and walked to a small fountain nearby. His reflection rippled in the water as he spoke again yesterday. "I found an old photo from my first day as a judge," he told Dr. Williams. "I was so proud, so certain I would be different from the old guard. I would be fair, just unbiased. When did I become exactly what I promised I wouldn't be?" A young janitor passed by, nodding respectfully. Judge Barrett noticed how he automatically tensed up at the sight of the young black man. A reaction he would have denied having just a week ago. "These responses," he said, turning to Dr. Williams, "they're so automatic, I didn't even know I was doing it. That's why they're called unconscious biases," she replied. "But now that you see them, you can change them." The sun had almost set, now casting long shadows across the garden. Judge Barrett thought about all the people who had passed through his courtroom over the years. How many lives have been affected by his unexamined prejudices? How many careers have been made harder because of his assumptions? "My daughter asked me today if I was going to resign," he said quietly. Dr. Williams looked at him thoughtfully. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her, I don't know yet, but I do know this: whether I stay on the bench or not, I have work to not just work on myself, but to help others see what I had been blind to for so long." As the darkness fell over the courthouse garden, Judge Barrett stood up, gathering his papers. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more revelations, more uncomfortable truths he would have to face. But for the first time in his career, he was truly seeing himself and his role within the justice system with clear eyes. The process for change had begun, not just in the policies of the courthouse, but in the heart and mind of a judge who finally learned to question his own judgments. The main hearing room of the Judicial Review Board was filled to capacity on Monday morning. Sunlight streamed in from floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a glow over lines of wooden benches holding a sea of lawyers, courtroom staff, and visitors. At the head of the room, 7 members of the board sat in a semicircle at a desk. Their faces were somber. Marcus Thompson smoothed his tie, preparing for his testimony. Gone was the angry prosecutor many had expected to see, and in his place, the same quiet dignity Head carried with him throughout the entire process. His wife Sarah sat in the front row, holding a small notebook where she had been documenting everything since that first Saturday. Chief Judge Rodriguez called the hearing to order. The gavel echoed through the hushed room. "Today, we examine the events of Saturday, November 9th, and the subsequent findings of our investigation into judicial conduct in this courthouse." Camera crews from local news stations lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking steadily. This wasn't just a routine hearing. It was that would alter their judicial district forever. Marcus stood at the podium, facing the board, distinguished members. He began, his voice clear and measured. "I'm not here today to seek punishment. I'm here because our system of justice needs healing." He opened a blue folder and began sharing his findings. "Over the past 10 days, our investigation team has reviewed hundreds of cases. We found patterns of bias that went far beyond one incident or one judge." He placed documents on the evidence table one by one. A Hispanic, the lawyer, being asked to show her bar card 3 times in one day. A black defendant being denied bail for the same crime that had a white defendant released. An Asian law clerk constantly being mistaken for a translator. Each example landed with quiet force. In the second row, Judge Barrett sat listening, his hands folded in his lap. His daughter, Rachel, had flown in from Chicago to sit beside him, her hand resting supportively on his arm. He looked different now, chastened and more aware. Marcus continued to put up graphs and statistics on the big screen, but hey, race, what counts, he said, whirling to face the entire room. Pressed with the discovery of these facts, Judge Barrett did one extraordinary thing. He listened, he learned, he admitted his biases. The room rustled with amazement. This wasn't the angry condemnation that many were expecting. The next one called to testify was Judge Barrett. He made his way slowly to the podium, looking much older than his 60 years. 10 days ago, he started, his voice trembling a little. I thought I was one of the good ones. I felt I treated everybody fairly. I was wrong. He related his process of self-discovery. Over the painful realization of his biases, late nights reflecting on his past judgments, and frank discussions with his daughter about justice and privilege. I am not here to justify my actions, he said emphatically. I am here to take responsibility for those actions, and more importantly, to be a part of the solution. Next, recommendations from racial bias expert Dr. Angela Williams were given. What it is going to take is not just punishment, she said. What we need is systemic change. Continuous bias training for all court personnel. Anonymous reporting systems for discriminatory behavior, regular review of judicial decisions to uncover patterns of bias. The board members took notes as she outlined a comprehensive plan for reform. This wasn't just about one judge anymore. It was about changing the entire system. Towards the end of the hearing, Marcus made his way back to the podium. Your Honors, he said, addressing each member of the board. We have a choice today. We can regard this as an isolated incident and move on, or we can use it as a catalyst for real change. He gestured to the packed room. Look around. Everyone here, judges, attorneys, staff, citizens, we all were part of this system, and we all had a responsibility to make it better. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, Chief Judge Rodriguez delivered their decision. Judge Barrett would be suspended for 3 months, during which he would undergo intensive bias training. But more importantly, the board adopted all of Dr. Williams' recommended reforms. As people filed out of the hearing room, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Judge Barrett. Mr. Thompson, the judge said softly, thank you for making this about change and not vengeance. Marcus nodded. He knew the gravitas of this moment. Sometimes, he said, accountability isn't punishment, it's growth. The reporters waiting outside the courthouse to spill the news had it wrong. The suspension or sanctions were merely headlines. The story was in the quiet conversations now taking place everywhere in the building: bias, justice, how to do better. This was accountability in its truest form, not only to face the consequences, but also to embark on the opportunity for significant change. It had been 6 months since that fateful Saturday morning, and the courthouse loomed tall against the spring sky. Its stone steps now proudly displayed fresh flower pots. A small but significant change, a symbol of new beginnings. Inside the building, a different kind of energy buzzed. Marcus Thompson walked into the main entryway, nodding to Security Officer Pete, who now greeted every visitor with the same respectful smile regardless of what they looked like. It was the changes, both small and big, that were everywhere, and it had started to come together. Others important, but all relevant today. It was a unique day. Special Judge Barrett was returning to the bench after going through his suspension and training program, but he wasn't going back to the same courthouse had left. The past 6 months had reconstituted the entire system. Marcus stopped by the newly mounted Equal Justice Resource Center on the first floor. The glass wool room hummed with activity as its staff assisted visitors in making their ways through the legal system. On its walls were clear, easy-to-read infographics in multiple languages explaining court procedures and rights. Mr. Thompson called out Maria Rodriguez, the center's new director. The latest numbers are in. complaints about discriminatory treatment are down 75% since we implemented the new protocols. Marcus smiled to himself, remembering how hard they'd worked to create these changes. The anonymous reporting system, regular bias training sessions, a monthly review of judicial decisions had all become standard practice. What started off as one incident had sparked a revolution in their judicial district. Upstairs, Judge Barrett stood in his chambers adjusting his robe. His daughter Rachel, who had moved back to town to work on judicial reform, helped straighten his collar. The past 6 months had changed him profoundly. The bias training hadn't been easy. Facing his prejudices had meant many uncomfortable moments and sleepless nights. "Ready, Dad?" Rachel asked. Seeing his nervous expression, different kind of ready, he replied, "A better kind." His first case of the day was about to begin. As he entered his courtroom, he noticed the small changes, the new signs clearly displaying defendants' rights in several languages, the more diverse court staff, the bias training certificates proudly displayed on the wall. The gallery was full. Many had come to watch this moment, including a number of attorneys who had filed complaints about discriminatory treatment. But they weren't here to criticize, they were here to witness change in action. Marcus sat on the back row, next to Dr. Angela Williams, who had been made the courthouse's permanent bias awareness consultant. They watched as Judge Barrett handled his first case, a property dispute between two small business owners. "Notice his language, Dr." Williams whispered to Marcus, neutral, respectful, focused on facts rather than assumptions. During the lunch break, the courthouse cafeteria hosted a special gathering. Judge Rodriguez stood before the assembled staff, holding up a report. "6 months ago, we faced a crisis," she announced. "Today we're becoming a model for other districts." Last week, 3 other courthouses requested our training materials. Judge Barrett took the podium next. His hands no longer shook when he spoke in public. He had learned to channel his nervousness into determination. "6 months ago, I was the problem," he began honestly. "Today, I'm part of the solution. But the real victory isn't my personal growth, it's the change I see in every corner of this building." He gestured to Marcus sitting quietly in the audience. "Mr. Thompson could have demanded my resignation. Instead, he showed all of us that true justice includes the chance to learn and grow." After the gathering, Marcus walked through the courthouse one last time. Before he headed home, he stopped by the wall where the motto, "Equal Justice Under Law," still hung below it. Now, there was an addition: "Justice sees with clear eyes and an open heart." His phone buzzed. A message from his daughter. "Dad, my law school professor used your case as an example today. Real change happens one person at a time." Outside, flowers were blooming during spring in the courthouse garden where Judge Barrett had spent so much time reflecting. A group of law students toured the new resource center, faces bright with hope for the future they would help shape. As Marcus drove home that evening, he thought about how one moment of injustice had led to waves of positive change. The courthouse wasn't perfect, no system created by humans ever could be, but it was better. More importantly, it was still improving, still growing, still learning. His wife met him at the door with a smile. "How was it?" she asked. Marcus looked back at the setting sun, thinking of all that had changed in 6 months. "It's not just a resolution," he replied. "It's a new beginning." And in courtrooms, in corridors throughout the building, that a new beginning was unfolding. One case, one person, one moment at a time.